tackle machines. It might be the dog days of the Major League Rugby offseason, but the fantasy MLR grind don't stop. On this week's episode of the Fantasy Ruckers Show, we continue our top fantasy MLR player reveal of the 2023 season. And this week, it's all about the tackle machines, the point getters from the forward pack, the back rowers. Find out who is in our top 5. And let me tell you, there are some interesting names. The Fantasy Ruckers Show starts right now.
Where rugby and the world of fantasy sports collide. Welcome to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, talking all things rugby from the MLR to leagues around the world. We're on top of it. Headphones on, pads off. This is the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Now, here are your hosts, Ryan Yee, Matt Yee, and Devin Vanderpool.
What's up, everybody? This is episode number 78 of the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Thank you so much to our Fantasy Ruckers League members, our Fantasy Ruckers community members, and everyone else tagging along on this journey of trying to make fantasy rugby a reality in the MLR. With you, as always, Matt Yee, Ryan Yee, Devin Vanderpool taking care of some family business. So it's Ruck and Roll and myself holding down the fort on this episode. And like I said in the teaser, it might be the dog days of the Major League Rugby offseason. But Matt, the fantasy rugby grind don't stop, and we're in the midst of our off-season fantasy rankings 2023 top player reveal, and it's all about the back row players in this episode, baby.
Yeah, and you know what? We don't stop. The news are slowing down, and the people will find out. But yeah, we definitely don't stop. We're going on with the back row, but what definitely is old news is that we're gonna find out that we still suck this episode.
Yeah, I mean, the predictions have been a tough one. We went through the front row players. We've gone through the second row players. It is now time for the back row players. And yeah, when you look in hindsight, it's always 2020 and definitely heading.
Brian, this is not our strong suit, okay? And the people need to know. You go, the lower the numbers, the worse that we are, all right? 1 through 3, awful. 4 through 5, awful. 6 through 8, all right, we're getting a little better, but not really. 9 through 10, Ryan.
That's where we get it. And that's
12 through 13.
Well, I mean, that's us as nines, as former nines. We didn't need to know what the big boys did up front. We just knew that, hey, you offloaded the ball to them every once in a while, keep them happy. They protected you up front, and then we make the magic happen in the back line. Isn't that right?
Well, magic maybe is an overstatement, but we made something happen. That's for sure.
Yeah, that is for sure. All right. Well, yeah, like we said, jam-packed episode in this one. It might be the slower days of the Major League Rugby offseason, but again, our offseason 2023 top player fantasy player reveal continues, and in this episode, it's all about those tackle machines, the back row players. And what's interesting in this one, Matt, is we're now starting to climb in the total fantasy point totals, which is fun because obviously front rowers, second rowers, there was an interesting strategy in there. But when it comes to back rowers, this is where the meat and potatoes of your fantasy lineup was in terms of slotting in a guy that was going to produce you a lot of points in the week. So we're going to break that all down this episode. Of course, go over the latest news and notes when it comes to roster moves, retirements, and maybe a little bit of tidbits about some rugby happening overseas. But again, before we get into it, like we say every single episode, if you aren't already, make sure you're following us at the Fantasy Ruckers. Handles up above there on the YouTube channel. If you're listening on the podcast, you find all those details down below. That's where you're going to find out when we are able, and we are still trying and working hard this offseason to get fantasy MLR to the masses. That's where you're going to find out first. So you'll make sure you'll want to follow us there. We also got a Discord community that's always fun and interactive, talking all things fantasy, MLR, and rugby just as a whole. And with World Cup coming up just around the corner here, I'm sure that community is absolutely going to be buzzing as well. And if that's not enough, check out our website, thefantasyruckers.com too, because there's a whole bunch of stats, nuggets on there. That's where we had our 2023 fantasy MLR season hosted. And if you're getting preparation, making early preparations for that 2024 fantasy MLR season with the hopes that you will be able to join a league yourself, that's where you'll want to start your research. So make sure you go check that out. But all right, Matt, let's get right into it here, and let's talk a little bit of news and notes. Like we said, obviously the slower days, not as much news. This is where we start to see MLR stats. James Dealey's in our Fantasy Ruckers League, his player movement tweets that come out every single week. You can check that out at Jam Delay. What, do you still call them tweets, or are they X's now? What the heck do you call them now?
They're always going to be tweets to me. Ryan.
But they are those graphics that James is coming out with, is shrinking and shrinking. But again, make sure sure you go check that out at Jam Delay on Twitter, at MLR Stats on Instagram. But yeah, a few roster moves to catch up on. Obviously, last week we were breaking down the Miami Sharks movement. If you haven't seen already, had Rugby Morning's John Fitzpatrick on the show to break down the entire 2023 collegiate draft and how that is going to make an impact not only in just the league but from a fantasy perspective as well. A lot of interesting tidbits, so you want to check out episode 77 for that one. But hey, let's catch up on some roster moves. I think the biggest one here is Thomas Milanos, I should say, of the Dallas Jackals. He's returning for the 2024 MLR season. The Argentinian winger started all of the 16 Dallas Jackal games in this past season, scoring 4 tries in total, tied for second on the team. From a fantasy perspective, this is a guy that racked up 122.4 fantasy points. Had those 4 tries, like you mentioned, 543 meters gained, and a adequate fantasy asset to have. Maybe not the top tier, but he was a guy that you could rely on a streaming basis, racking you some points, and had the potential always to go off with a high of 22.1 points in round 10.
I mean, he definitely got on some of our radars last season, midway through the year, as the Dallas Jackals kind of started picking it up. And he was a guy that I know that I've picked up a few times, and I think I played him in the playoffs and relied on him too. So definitely going to be a good guy to have back, and will definitely be on a team next year in some sort of fantasy league.
Yeah, it should be interesting. So he will be returning to the Dallas Jackals, and a guy that you may be looking for from a fantasy perspective at the tail end of your bench there to slot in. Obviously, a lot of that's going to have to do with the direction that the Dallas Jackals goes, how much improvement they can make. But I think in the end, Tommy Milanos is definitely going to be fantasy relevant in 2024, and a guy that's going to get at least some looks during the season. Some other roster moves happening across the league. Got to mention that there's some overseas moves in. Cam Dodson going over to Orlac in the French's Pro D2 league. Obviously, this is something that he's done this before. He's played for them before, and we've seen him return. So again, not crazy stuff there. The big one here, though, Mike Shepard, a longtime Toronto Arrows staple, hanging up the boots. We're seeing retirements left and right here as we get deeper to the offseason, and Mike Shepard is the latest one to be calling it a rugby career, and a guy that has been a familiar name with that Arrows club for quite some time.
Yeah, one of the original Arrows, one of the first guys started in that original Arrows team, with that ridiculous logo that they had before of the rocket ship or whatever the heck it was. One of not just a legend with the Arrows, but a legend in Ontario rugby as a whole. Definitely, for those of you that know Ontario rugby, a Stony Creek legend, that's for sure. But yeah, it's crazy. Every time you thought of Ontario rugby, Mike Shepard's name was always synonymous with it. So it's crazy to see him finally hang up the boots. And honestly, I'm a little surprised, but hey, it's always time. It's time when it's time.
I do remember the days when we'd be going up against Stony Creek in our men's days playing for the Markham Irish. And yeah, he was a guy that you were always game planning for, and was a guy that was mentioned, at least in the build up to that preparation. But yeah, from a Toronto Arrows standpoint, obviously I've seen past years where he had a heavier involvement with the Arrows side. This past year, he had a stretch of games where he did start between rounds 5 and round 9. He had 5 straight matches there, but he was kind of a guy that was getting phased out of that starting side, stepping into that lock position this year, and really, 42 fantasy points as a total. He only started again in 6 of the 12 matches he played in, so not really fantasy relevant as he has been in the past for the world of fantasy MLR. But again, that doesn't I think knock any of the special things that he's done for the Toronto Arrows and for Ontario rugby as a whole, that's for sure. And I guess congratulations to Mike Shepard for a nice career here, and wrapping it up here in the world of rugby, and to go on to do bigger and better things. And then lastly here, Matt, I know you wanted to talk about this before we wrap up this news and notes segment, was that obviously the NPC Bunnings Cup is in full force right now. Obviously, we've mentioned it throughout the episodes during this offseason after the finish of the 2023 Major League Rugby year. A whole bunch of guys moving over to the NPC Bunnings Cup to get some more playing time. We know that our very own friend of the show, Andrew Quattrin, is over there training with the team over there. So
he lied to us, Ryan. He lied to us. He said he was going over there just to train, but they're in week 3 now, and I believe the New England Free Jacks have just moved over to become one with the Manawatu Turbos. You know, this weekend they've got Quatrin starting at hooker, Cole Keith coming off the bench. They got John Poland at 9. They got Bodine Waka coming off the bench. They got Tanila Filimone coming off the bench. I mean, it's getting a little bit ridiculous the way that they have just went over there and infected that team. I feel bad for them because turns out they're third last in the league. So, you know, clearly the New England Free Jacks, you know, maybe their infection, they need to tone it back a little bit. But I think from a fantasy perspective, you know, it just shows just how little that we need to worry about this, and something that we keep harping on, right? Like, guys are going over there to get better in the offseason, and you would never see this many New England Free Jack players go over there simply just not to come back with the goal to not to come back to the MLR. It's pretty clear that, you know, those guys are going over there, getting better, coming back to the New England Free Jack side. For guys like, you know, Johan Momsen's are also on this team as well. He's going over there, getting better, coming back to not Atlanta, to LA maybe. And coming back with some more experience, some more game time, some more kind of experience against better competition. And if you want to support a team, you know, you're a fan of the MLR, you want to support a team that has a bunch of MLR guys, Manawatu seems to be the way to go. But trust me, you know, there's a lot of teams out there that are probably better, like my boys in Wellington, but they don't got many MLR guys, and that's unfortunate. But yeah, just wanted to throw that out there. It's crazy to see the New England Free Jacks literally infect New England.
Yeah, it's literally the New England Free Jacks 2.0 over there. But it's a positive sign. I mean, it's cool to see that, you know, players who are in Major League Rugby are getting opportunity overseas, and it's only going to enhance the product that we're going to have here during the Major League Rugby season, and hopefully kind of bring back some of that upper echelon type rugby here, and obviously that's going to have big waves here in the world of fantasy MLR, and in just producing high quality rugby and improving that here on the North American soil, which should be
100%.
solid.
100%. Yeah. And I mean, they're scattered. The MLR guys are scattered across the league. You know, Bay of Plenty. You see guys like Jason Potros, you know, playing for Taranaki as well. This is also just for fantasy guys. And if you're looking forward to a fantasy season, and when fantasy goes to the masses we've seen how many guys or how many NPC Bunnies Cup guys come into the MLR. We've seen that kind of invasion from those sides, just with the way the schedule works out. And you look at these guys that are playing well overseas in the NPC Bunnies Cup, you see that translate to the MLR, right? You see guys like Jason Potros, you see guys like Tom Florence, you see guys like Henry Bell, guys that we talked about. These guys are having good seasons in the NPC Bunnies Cup, maybe not good enough to make a Super Rugby side, but they're coming back and being able to show that overseas in North America. And a little bit of scouting that you can do for the draft for maybe some guys that get signed, some guys that are returning. You know, do a little work, figure out who you're going to be drafting.
And that's coming from the 2023 Fantasy Ruckers League champ himself.
Exactly.
So, that's the extra work that you got to do if you're going to reach that level. I guess that was the big change for you, huh, Matt? From the 2022 season going into the 2023, you just had to do a little.
There's a lot of changes that had to happen.
Bit more work.
A lot of changes had to happen.
No kidding. All right. Well, yeah. Again, exciting to see guys overseas that have Major League Rugby roots playing over there. Also, definitely exciting to see guys that we know here on the show playing overseas as well. So fun to watch that. And again, and during the dog days of this Major League Rugby off season, why not digest a little bit more NPC Bunnies Cup action if you can, and other rugby around? I mean, there's no shortage of it right now. International play is going on. World Cup is just around the corner. It's gonna be a fun
World Cup where you got to watch even more MLR guys. You know, we'll get to watch Namibia, get to watch Samoa. All these MLR guys
coming Canada, in. Not USA.
Canada, not the US. But who wants to watch them when you can watch LaRue Milan and Adrian Boyson tear it up for Namibia, or Sama Malolo tear it up for Samoa? So, you know, MLR is around the world.
Yeah, it's true. It is true, and it's only growing more and more. But all right, let's get into kind of the crux of this episode. Again, we talked about it at the top of the show. We talked about it in the teaser. It's about the tackle machines today, the back row players. That again, we kind of have been breaking down position by position. It's really highlighted the what's the word, the prototype or the kind of makeup of what these different positions provide for fantasy MLR lineups. We broke down the front row 2 episodes ago. We really kind of were starting to get a feeling about how there's a select few guys that you can choose from in that space that is really going to provide you that points advantage. But again, the highest point totals that you're seeing from a front row position is just above that 100-point mark, and it falls off pretty dang quickly. From the second row position that we broke down last episode, you're starting to see that point total creep up a little bit, but again, not that high. You're finding second rowers having a hard time breaking that 100 total fantasy point mark when it comes to the 2023 fantasy MLR season. You have some outliers in those positions. Sam Galla for second row, who did a fantastic job finishing as that top second rower. Samuel Malolo, Matt, like you mentioned, 122.7 fantasy points for the front row. But for the back row, it gets interesting here, and we talked about this is where we start to enter the meat and potatoes of your fantasy MLR lineup, where this is where the positions that are really going to get you those points on a week in and week out basis. You can almost relate it, and I wish we had Vandy here to kind of give us that similarity between other fantasy sports, including fantasy football. This is kind of like we're getting closer to the quarterback position, where you're starting to see a guy that or a position that all across the board is going to get you high fantasy points. It's just selecting those guys that can get you that upper tier of it, and that's what this back row position kind of provides. Before we kind of reveal here the top 5 fantasy back rowers from the 2023 season, Maddie, kind of your perspective. We've gone through the front row and second row so far. You've had the time to break down over the past week what the top back rowers are, and you obviously experienced it throughout the 2023 fantasy MLR season. Am I correct in characterizing that this is where we're starting to see the guys that really put up the points here for your fantasy lineup?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I look at it, when you look at the forwards, front row, second row were ones where you could live with not getting a high point scoring, but back row was one where you wanted a guy. You wanted someone on your team that you can rely on that is consistently getting double digit points, not something that you expected from the front row or second row, but the back row. If you could get double digit points every week in, week out, it was something that only the top guys were doing and something that you really reap the benefits of. And that's really the way that I look at this position is you just wanted a guy, you needed a guy, and you benefited from having a guy in this position.
Yeah, and it's a good way to put it too, because I feel like it hurts you even more. You could live with through the 2023 fantasy MLR season with your front rower getting 3 or 4 points. You could live with your
Mhm.
second rower getting, 3 or 4 points. But if you had a back rower in your lineup that was getting under double digits even,
Yeah.
the likelihood that you were winning that week was very, very slim unless someone else on your lineup popped off. The point foundation really started with this back row position. Obviously, when we start getting towards the back players here in the coming weeks, you're going to start to see more of that. But back row, at least from a forward perspective, this is where you are providing your point totals here. So let's pull it up. Let's bring up the top 5 fantasy MLR back rowers from the 2023 season. You see the names up on your screen if you're watching on the YouTube video. For the podcast listeners, I'll list it out for you here. And to have no surprise, the number 1 fantasy MLR back rower of the 2023 season was Vian Conradi. He was in a league of its own when it came to the back row position with regards to fantasy. 193.8 points total for the season.
Wow.
And that was only in the 13 games that he started. He obviously missed a couple, I believe, due to injury, I want to say.
Yeah.
But yeah, not even playing the maximum total from the fantasy season, he was still miles ahead from the next player, who is Adrian Boyson of the Dallas Jackals, a still admirable 162.7 fantasy points on the season. Following up behind him, number 3, Jamison Fa'anana Schultz of Old Glory DC, 158.4 fantasy points. Charles Elton at that 4 spot, 157.7 fantasy points for the Seattle Seawolves. And then Reichard Hadding, your boy, Maddie, 138.7 fantasy points to
Hi,
round
boy.
out the top 5 there in that final spot. But you see those names on the list here, just kind of initial impressions of the top 5 fantasy MLR back rowers that kind of stand out to you as a whole before we start breaking down them individually.
Yeah, when you look back on the season, obviously not when you look from the start of the season. When you look back on the season, because our predictions suck, it makes sense. There's no surprises really there. I think, you kind of think that if you expanded it to 6 or 7, you'd start to see more of the guys that you would expect. The one for me, I think that just screams out to me is just the fact that old Riker Royd Boy Hatting is sitting there at 11 matches or 10 matches, 11 tries, and still sitting in the top 5. I think it's just ridiculous. And the guy, you talk about tackle machines in the back row, and we'll get into more detail, but you talk about tackle machines in the back row. I mean, this guy hated tackling, clearly, right? And the guy is still scoring in the top 5. It's just ridiculous.
No, it is ridiculous. And again, when you look at this top 5, each of them kind of bring their own thing to the table that allowed them to get to this top 5. They've done
except Conradi. Conradi just did everything.
Sure, yeah, of course, and we'll get into him right here in a second. But yeah, like it's interesting to see the way that they're able to get points. And again, what is very abundantly clear to me is that there is a clear-cut tier system here, especially in the back row position. I mean, Vian Conradi was in a league of his own, like we mentioned. Really, that undisputed top back rower. If you had him, you were very happy. You would say the 2 to 4 positions in Boyson, Fainana, Schultz, and Elton kind of slot in at that tier 2. And then Reichert Hatting, and again, if you expanded it out to maybe 6 or 7 players, that's kind of your tier 3 falling behind, and within that 130 fantasy point range there. But yeah, it is impressive that Reichert was able to slot in there with only playing 10 matches.
And I mean, we'll get into this after we go through the top 5, but I think there's some guys that they missed out on this top 5. They missed out because of missed games, but if they played a full season, and it's a big if, right? But if they played a full season, I think we're seeing a closer matchup, right? We're seeing guys a little bit closer to Vian Conradi. And yeah, we'll get into it after the top 5, but I think there's a few guys that I would have expected to be in the top 5 that I think just got held back by availability, really.
Sure. All right. Well, let's get into these individual guys and let's talk about Vian Conradi. I mean, the numbers really speak for themselves.
Ridiculous.
5 tries on the season, cracked that 1,000 meter gain mark with 1,022 total on the year. 192 tackles. Again, he started in 13 of the 13 games he played in, missed a couple due to injury, and you start to break it down. I mean, 11 double-digit fantasy performances, and those 11 came all straight through the entire season. Really, the only 2 that he didn't get those 2 double-digit performances was at the tail end of the season when he, I believe, in rounds 15 and 16, where even in round 16 he was just below that mark at 9.7 fantasy points. But you look at the numbers he was able to put up. I mean, he did it from the tackle perspective. Only 2 matches where he didn't get double-digit tackles. A season or a game high 21 in round 14, which is solid. And then again, the big thing here that I think really pushed him above all the other back row players is the 1,000 meters gain that he got. I mean, there are 3 different games where he surpassed the triple-digit meters gain mark, and even then, there were a whole bunch of other handful of games where he was hovering around that area. So I mean, really, like you said, Matt, Vian Conradi was someone that was the epitome of a top back row player, exactly what you wanted. Meters gained, tackles, 4 breakdown steals on the season as well. So mix that in too. He was really the perfect player to have and really did it all.
Yeah. And I mean, I think for me, the big thing was just those meters gained. I mean, to crack 1,000 meters gain as a back row, it's just ridiculous. Right, like it is ridiculous what he did this season, and we heard it straight from Quattrin, from Q. Right, like the things that guy does is just unbelievable, and it just clearly showed fantasy wise. And I think when we look at who was the top back rows this year, we look at him as kind of the clear cut top back row, and we look at our fantasy rankings. He's exactly where he's supposed to be.
Yeah, no kidding. And I mean, if he plays those couple more matches in the fantasy MLR season, there's no question that he's cracking that 200 point mark, which is kind of around where Reichert Hatting was last year when we considered him the top back rower heading into the season. But a little bit of a preview for those predictions to come. But yeah, just a spectacular player. And then this is where we start to enter the tier 2. So let's talk about Adrian Boyson now of the Dallas Jackals, a 30-point drop off right? A 30-point drop off from
Yeah.
that second best back rower. It just emphasizes how much better Vian Conradi was from a fantasy perspective over everyone else. And this was a guy, I mean, heading into the season was drafted in the 5th round, 6th pick. So man, he was a steal there at that round. I mean, you still spent a decent amount of draft capital. I mean, we'll get into it. Rickard Hatting picked with that second overall pick there. You'd really you wish you could swap that up if you knew that Vian Karate was going to do what he did in 2023. But
Yeah.
yeah, pretty crazy stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, having Adrian Boyson, you just knew what you're getting, and what you're getting was consistency from him,
Mhm.
right? Every week, you knew exactly that you would get, close or over double-digit points. You knew you were going to get the tackles, and you knew the big lad had a potential to kind of make it into the try zone. And out of all the times, you kind of felt like he was going to play full 80, or he's going to play at least 70 minutes almost every week. That was the kind of nice, all reliable that you could have in him. And I think really those tackles were what drove him to this number 2 spot. But you bring up a good point, right? Like, one, he came out of nowhere, right? Like, I think he got 100 points last year. If we look at using our points for the 2022 season, and he was 100 ranked overall, I think. And you just didn't expect him to end up being the back row number 2, and definitely didn't expect that in our predictions. But he had a season, and he really drove that home with the way that he was making tackles. So yeah, that really carried him to that number 2 spot.
Yeah, and I think he's basically what I want to say. He's basically a Vian Conradi without the meters gained, essentially.
Yeah.
Right? You break it down to the crux of it. He just wasn't the guy that was able to do that. But I mean, he made up for a lot of it. I mean, 243 tackles on the season. Like, that's crazy. And there was only only one match all year long where he did not get into that double-digit mark, and that happened back in round 2. And I mean, he was there, he was available. 15 of the 15 matches he played in, he started. I mean, 1,100 minutes on the entire fantasy season. Just kind of lacked that meters gain ability. But I think, to your point, Matt, he's just a guy that was reliable, and he may not have that kind of ceiling that Vian Conradi had, where he would bust out for a triple-digit meters gained match, or he was scoring, a whole bunch. But in the games that he did score, and you knew he was going to get that tackle baseline, is what I'm saying. You knew that he was going to hover around that 10-point mark because of the tackles that he was going on every single week.
Yeah.
And then when you add like a try-scoring opportunity in there as well, that's when he was kind of reaching that next level. Maybe not a Vian Conradi level, but was making you very, very happy as a manager, because you knew that you were never going to get that really low floor, but it had the ability to kind of reach a higher ceiling with that consistency from a week-to-week basis.
Yeah, I mean, it was all about, like you said, the consistency from the tackles, and that's what got you those easy kind of double-digit points almost every week, right? So, yeah, that's what you love about him. That's for sure. That's what I loved about being a fantasy manager and having him on my squad. I'll be interested to see what it looks like when the Dallas Jackals are improving, when the Dallas Jackals are getting better, winning more games. Does that affect his meters gained? Does that affect the number of tries that he scored? And maybe he does end up being a little bit closer to a Vian Conradi, closer to in point totals for sure, and see where that takes him.
Yeah, we'll see what goes that, but definitely the consistency was there. And again, I mean, there is that 30-point difference between Vian Conradi and Adrian Boyson, but I don't think when you're within that fantasy season, did you really feel that huge difference? I think the consistency made up for a lot of that you knew that you're reliable. You knew you weren't going to get those crazy amount of points that Vian Conradi was going to have, but you were happy and content with what Boyson was doing for you. And it didn't feel like there was that big of a drop off. Obviously, from a number standpoint, it was. And Vian Conradi was just so special this season. But I think as you were going through the 2023 year, it didn't necessarily feel like there was that big of a gap just because of that consistent level.
Yeah. And I mean, we talked about this before, right? Like, the back row is where if you weren't getting double-digit points, you were going to hurt that week. Like, that's just how it was from the back row position. And if you had one guy, maybe it wasn't your flex, but it was in your back row position, and your flex was a guy who had a little bit more upside, having one guy that can always put double-digit points on the board was something that you could always rely on. That was a safe haven, knowing that you could do that and knowing that you could go into the week with that much less risk or that much less taking a chance on somebody else.
Absolutely. All right, let's shift on to number 3 here. Jamison Fa'anana Schultz of Old Glory, DC, just behind Adrian Boyson in this third spot, 158.4 points, 3 tries on the season, 756 meters gained, 176 tackles, started in the 13 of the 13 games that he played for Old Glory. Obviously, Old Glory's captain. You knew that when he was going to be on the pitch, he was going to be available, he was going to be on the field. But the big thing here for Jamison was the 8 breakdown steals on the season. There's a lot of weight here with our breakdown point totals here in the Fantasy Ruckers League and in Fantasy MLR. We wanted to reward that ability to turn over the ball because we know in an actual match how big it is to gain that possession and be able to see the ball. And Fa'anana Schultz was someone that really had the ability to do that. Wasn't you know, cracking the craziest tackle totals in terms of compared to the other 2 guys. Wasn't, he was kind of that middle ground between Vien and Boyson when it came to meters gained. Didn't score as many tries as the 2, but that breakdown steal really propelled him into that third spot to allow him to keep up with Boyson and be in this top 5.
Yeah, and I think last year and I remember going to the season, the one kind of resentment of him was that, look, is he going to be able to be disciplined enough? Because we saw last year, right? Like yellow cards upon yellow cards upon red cards upon punching Captain Canada, right? Like just endless discipline issues. And we saw how much red cards and yellow cards were hurting you as a fantasy manager. This year was able to stay out of the bin, right? I don't think he was the type of guy that was consistent enough to be like a Boyson, like a Conradi, being able to be that all reliable. But he was a guy with massive upside. He gets those games with the breakdown steals. He gets those games where maybe he's scoring a try, and he gets those games maybe where he's a high tackle count or a high meters gain. You never knew what you're going to get from him. But if you got something really good one week, you knew that you're going to get pretty good upside, and being able to get those points was always something that was valuable for him.
Yeah, and I mean there was a stretch of games between rounds 5 and round 8 where 17.1 points, 12.6, 12.9, 15.5, 21, 11.7. Like he had that ability like you're talking about. It's just that there was a little bit of a lower floor when it came to Vian Conradi and not as much consistency when you're comparing that to Boyson. He just had a little bit more fluctuating tackle numbers that I think resulted in some of that. Again, still very, very good totals. I mean, he had double-digit tackles in every single match except for 3 of them all season. It's just that compared to Vien and compared to Boyson especially, who Boyson was probably hovering more towards that 15 tackle mark, was pretty much the average for him. Jamison Fa'anana Schultz was hovering more around the 10, which over the course of 15, 13 matches, it makes a big difference. But again, only following about 5 points off of Boyson, and again, breakdown steals was a huge part of that. And again, it was good to see that. I think a big part of it was also him getting that captainship role with Old Glory DC, knowing that discipline was going to be essential. He needed to be on the pitch, and as a result of that, he was able to rack up these numbers. And the concern that he was going to get a yellow card or going to get that red card definitely dipped down throughout the entire season, and he ended up being one of the better players out of the entire league, out of any position, especially from the back row position. He cracks this top 3 this top 3 here in terms of top fantasy MLR back rowers for the 2023 season. So cool to see that. Shifting on to number 4 now, Charles Elton of the Seattle Seawolves, a name that went undrafted in our league. I will mention Boyson went undrafted as well. Fa'anana Schultz went in the 4th round, 7th pick. But Charles Elton, a name that I think heading into the season you really didn't expect to be in this, especially with the knowledge of kind of how busy that Seattle back row lineup was. But Elton took a stranglehold of it, and it's interesting when you look deeper into how he was able to get his 157.7 points on the total of the season. Only 1 try. But what he was able to do was 244 tackles. He started in 15 of 15 games. He had 12 80-plus minute matches, was a big one out of all the back rowers. He was just on the field a lot. And again, kind of like Jamison Schultz, he supplemented that with 7 breakdown steals on the season, which ended up being huge and really solidified him at that number 4 spot and that last kind of guy in that tier 2 of back rowers from a fantasy perspective.
Yeah, just the prototypical back row there, tackles, breakdown, steals. The guys I topped the league in tackles with 244, right? I don't know, top the league, but definitely top the back rows for sure. And you didn't get the meters gained, you didn't get the tries from him, but we talk about what we liked from Adrian Boyson. It's the same things that we're liking from Charles Elton. And the way that he was able to get consistently like 15 plus, 16 plus tackles a game was just something that you could always rely on, something that you could always kind of feel comfortable with putting in your lineup and knowing that, hey, he has the potential of also getting a breakdown steal. Yeah, it was always a risk of kind of whether he was going to start or not with that back row position. But we saw the injuries that kind of happened to that Seattle Seawolves back row throughout the season, with Ronan Foley going out and then Riker Hadding going out. So he definitely was the one that benefited, unfortunately, from the demise of some of his teammates.
Yeah, and I will say we talked about kind of how Boyson was a consistent but lower ceiling version of Vian Conradi. Charles Elton is almost just Adrian Boyson with an even lower ceiling. Like you knew
Yeah.
that he was going to get around that 10-point mark, but just because he didn't have that try scoring ability or that try scoring opportunities that Boyson saw, with Boyson scoring 6 tries on the season,
Mhm.
Charles Elton only scoring 1, but he supplemented that with the breakdown steals. And from a season long perspective, that's going to get you up into that top 5 position. It's just that when you get that one breakdown steal or those 2 breakdown steals in a match, it's just not that same explosive fantasy point power as getting a try is during that match. So that's why I would say Elton, very solid, just didn't have from a week to week
Yeah.
basis that
And
same ceiling as Boyson had, and then even further didn't have that same ceiling that Vian Conradi had.
And a perfect example of that is you look at his 2 highest weeks, right? You look at round 16, 17, he's got around 15 points each week, right? No tries, under 50 meters gain. But then you look at the tackles, 20 plus tackles, 2 breakdown steals each game. That was his ceiling. That was what he could do for you. He wasn't going to get over 50 plus meters gain. He wasn't going to get a try. But if he got 20 plus tackles, if he got 1 or plus breakdown steals, that was the ceiling, and that's what you were expecting from him.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's go to number 5 to round out this top
Another
5. I know,
Seawolf.
Matt, you want to talk about this guy a whole bunch.
I
But
do
yeah,
not.
another Seawolf, Reichert Hadding, a guy that heading into the season, like we mentioned, alluded to
This
earlier.
is stupid, Ryan.
The expectation was
This is
super
dumb.
high for him. He was drafted as the 2nd overall player.
Well,
And this is not your prototypical back row player. This is a guy that's not getting the tackles that you thought he was going to get, or that you would expect a back row player to get. Not even necessarily, the meters gain was nothing crazy special, but I mean, 11 tries. 11 tries in only 10 matches played. And this is how he got his points in 2022 that made him so valuable from a fantasy perspective. This is how he got his points in 2023. And he did it in only 10 matches. And you can only imagine if you extrapolate it out and he didn't have that injury in the middle of the season, where he would be at. Because, I mean, 11 tries for a back row player is incredible.
it is just dumb. Like, I don't even know how to explain it. Like, the fact that he played 10 games and he was still able to crack the top 5 for back rows over guys like Thomas Tuival, over guys like Lance Williams, guys who played full seasons. And
Yep.
mind you look at Lance Williams, you look at Thomas Tuival, you look at Conrado Rua, guys like that. They had good years. Like, they had solid years. And Riker Hadding comes in and drops 11 tries on their head, plays 10 games and says, yeah, don't worry, I got top 5 sealed. It's just ridiculous. And the fact that he was able to do that with, 73 tackles on the year in 10 games, that's averaging a single digit number of tackles every game. And that is just stupid.
Yeah, he only broke the double-digit tackle mark 3 times on the season when he played. But I mean, even in those games, I mean, a perfect example, right? You look at what he did in round 2, or even what he did in round 2, 3, and 4. I mean, 8 tackles, 9 tackles, 8 tackles. But he scores 2 tries in round 2, 2 tries in round 3, a try in round 4, gives him
Yeah.
22.7, 19.8, 15.2 respectively. I mean, those are numbers that you expect of a back
And
3 player. You know what I
yeah.
mean? Like
And
that it's insane.
mind you, he didn't even have a great full 10 games.
Hmm.
Like it wasn't the year like last year. This was actually I would say play wise, it was a worse year than last year.
Sure, sure.
You know, with the games that he played because we actually saw Riker Hatting break a little bit. You know, you look at round 6, you look at round 7, you look at round 9. Those are the weeks where he just comes off a double digit point week and you kind of think, what the heck happened? Why has he gone silent these past 2 weeks? And he still ends up having having this type of season of being in our top 5 for back rows.
Now, I will say, from a fantasy point total, and you accumulate all the points from the entire season, you know, you look at him in the top 5 and you're impressed with what he did. But I do think, though, that you're not, you don't feel, it's not a good feeling
No.
with him in the top 5. You know, you
No.
you might have
I
drafted.
mean, the guy's
right-
on steroids, Ryan. Of course it's not a good thing.
Well, what I'm saying is, I mean, he was drafted with the second overall pick. You're expecting him to do big things. There, you took advantage of those games, obviously, that he played and was able to score these really high
Well,
points.
yeah.
But just having that lack of availability this season, it's a double-edged sword.
He
You're
didn't live up to
impressed,
his potential for sure. He didn't
You're-
live up to where he was drafted.
right? And I mean, it's a double-edged sword, like I mentioned. Like you're impressed because you're able to capitalize on certain games where he absolutely pops off and scores 20 plus points. But you just wish you had that opportunity to put him in your lineup like that
Yeah.
on those games that he was unavailable. So
And
impressive that he got into the top 5 with only playing 10 matches and racking up 138 points, but also kind of it hurts to see him in that top 5 and that question of what he could have done and what he could have finished as if he was
Yeah.
available for, you know, even 3 more matches than what he was this season.
yeah, for sure. And that kind of alludes to what I was bringing up before we got into top 5 of like, there are guys that are outside of this top 5 that definitely could have been in there, but lost out just due to availability.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to name some guys. Tom Florence. The
Yep.
guy was an animal. The guy got hurt. Nola Gold felt it when he got hurt, but he was playing unreal rugby throughout that and was a fantasy kind of a top back row for the first part of the season before he got hurt. You look at guys like Christian Poitevin, right? Christian Poitevin, you look at the way that he was playing when he played.
Yeah.
You know, he got hurt halfway through the season, but he was putting up double digit points consistently, a breakdown steal magician. He was just a guy that, you know, was definitely somebody who, if he played a full season, could have ended up in that top 5 and potentially pushed Riker Hatting or push some of these other guys that maybe we didn't expect to see up there out. And then the last guy that I think we have to kind of talk about is Gideon Van Vyk,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like we look at how many times have we talked about him this year, and he had a mixture of injury. He had a mixture of being red carded and suspended, right? But his year was unreal. I mean, the 8
Yeah.
games that he played was just ridiculous. He got
Yeah.
108 fantasy points in 8 games, right? He
Yeah.
was on track to get 200 plus fantasy points
That's true.
if he continued playing the way that he was. And he had down weeks within those 8 games. Like, I think it was just, there were some guys there that I think we really talked about throughout the year that just missed out on this top 5 and maybe is why we're seeing that disparity between 1 and 2.
Sure. No,
Right?
that's a great point. There
Right?
might
Like
be
I think
that
those
slotted
guys,
in there.
yeah, I think those guys and Riker Hatting too. Like I think Riker Hatting fills out that gap in between
Mhm.
the two. But we saw so many of the top back rows in the league kind of get hurt, not be available, be red carded, be suspended. And yeah, I'm not gonna make early excuses for our top 5 because I don't even know if we had those guys in our top 5. But it just, I think in terms of that disparity there, where we're seeing that gap, I think that was just a result of some of the top guys in the league getting hurt and not being available to play.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Matt. And I will say too, you look at some of these other guys too. I mean, Lance Williams just missing out
Yeah.
of that top 5 with the 6th spot. He had a pretty stellar season. Again, had that ability to really, you know, get those tries and he had tackle numbers here and there. And you know, 5 tries on the season. He was available. Conrad Aurora was another guy that was kind of a guy that up there, 185 tackles on the season, double-digit tackles outside of just 3 matches. Honestly, looking at the numbers now, like I would have probably rather had it's hard to say now, but I mean, I think I would have rather had Conrado Rura than Reichert Hadding on the season, just because I knew that if
Yeah.
I looked at hindsight, like, yes, it was nice to have Reichert Hadding pop off for 20 points in a couple of those games, but to have Conrado Rura for the entire season and him at least to get you double-digit points every year
I
or
mean,
every match for the most part,
yeah.
it was pretty solid. But again, it's just that disparity. There is so much what if in this back row position that could have happened due to injury and due to availability
Mhm.
that really it could have turned different. And like you mentioned, Matt, that gap between Villa and Adrian Boyson might have been filled out a little bit more by some of these
Yeah.
guys who are on
And
pace from a at least per match perspective to have so many points.
and I don't think this will be representative of what we're going to see in the draft next year, right? Like, I think we're still going to see a Ian Conradi at top. We're still going to see a Riker Hadding, behind or in front of Ian Conradi potentially. After Tom Florence the year that he had, Gideon Van Dyke, I think we're going to see these guys all jump up in those draft rankings when we're looking at it, looking at next season, above Adrian Boyson, above maybe not Fernando Schultz, but Charles Elton, right? Like, I think back row is kind of the one position that we're going to go through where we're like, this wasn't representative of, I think, the best back rows on the season.
Yeah.
Just simply because of availability.
And well, I think there's a lot more of that thinking too going into it because there's such a need for you to get a guy that has the ability to get you points at this position. So
Yeah.
many of the back row players have the ability to get you 10 points every single week. There's a handful of them that have that ability and has that ceiling of popping off for 25 points and giving you
Yep.
back three numbers. And it's
Exactly.
some of those guys like you mentioned. It's a Vian, it's a Reichert Hadding, it is a Tom Florence, it's a Gideon Van Dyke, it's a Christian Poitevin. You're gonna bypass some of these guys that maybe are a little bit safer options just because you have that need that guys are going to get 10 points, the guys that you're facing off with in a matchup. You want to have that kind of X factor on top of that. But again, a lot of it though goes towards it as well, Matty, about your makeup build. I mean, if you at least out of the positions that we've talked about so far here on the show in the past 3 weeks, you get a Dylan Fawcett at your front row position who has that high ceiling ability to get you a whole bunch of points and give you that advantage at the front row. Maybe you are more comfortable with picking a guy like Boyson. Maybe you're more comfortable with picking a guy like Charles Elton because you already know you have that ceiling at a position elsewhere. Again, we've mentioned it on many episodes before. It's really about that roster build and supplementing those positions together, and really contextualizing kind of who you're picking at certain spots based on the guys that you already have on your roster. And we're obviously going to get deeper into that when we get closer to the 2024 draft. We start doing mock drafts and we start doing things like that. But I think this just emphasizes it even further. But again, it's a whole lot of fun, Matt, to talk about the back row position because again, fantasy is all about points and you love talking about positions that give you a whole lot of points. And the back row position is that, at least from a forward sense, that has that ceiling of getting you 20 plus points. And it's always cool to see that. And it's with guys like Via and with guys like Tom Florence, with guys like Christian Poitevin and Gideon Van Dyke.
Yeah.
It's fun talking about them racking up point totals that are week changing point totals. You're seeing a lot more of that from the back row position than you are from, let's say, a second row or even a front row.
For sure.
All right.
Now let's see how much we suck.
Yeah, let's get into it. Let's talk about those top fantasy MLR back row predictions we had heading into the 2023 year and see how many of those names that we just talked about really made the list. So we'll switch over that to now and pull that up. And the rough stretch for Ryan and Matt continue because again, you can see that only one of the names makes it into our top 5. I think we got better here, Matt. I think we got better.
I don't think
we're
so.
hovering with a few more guys that are kind of around that top 5. I mean, Lance Williams is right there in our top 5. You had Mitch Jacobson, who I mean was in the top 25.
But,
at this point, my standard is getting lower and lower each week.
And you know what?
I'm trying to be more.
You took a gimme with this because you put Riker Hadding up there. I refused. If you go back and remember my stance, I refused to put somebody who used drugs in my top 5.
That's true. That's true. Well,
So
let me break it down for the people who are listening on the podcast first, and then we'll get into it and what happened here. And some of these guys we've already talked about. But Reichert Hadding, I had at number 1. Lance Williams, number 2. Devin Short, number 3. Henkel Gramicius on number 4, and Ronan Foley at 5. To give you the list of Matt's predictions, Lance Williams, he had at number 1. Devin Short at 2. Reichert Hadding at 3. Brendan O'Connor at 4. Number 5, Mitch Jacobson. So a little bit of differing names here on our list. But I mean, I don't think I need to get much into Reichert Hadding at number 1. I think, again, he had the ability. He finishes off as the back row 5, had the ability clearly to get to that top position if he was available. Just didn't have that. Didn't do that. For you, Lance Williams, you had number 1. I had number 2. Finishes off just outside the top 5, like we mentioned, at back row 6. I mean, you can't hate it. He was close.
it was
Didn't
hard.
It didn't have that explosive season that we saw in 2022, which resulted him in being in this in this top 5 spot.
I mean, it's difficult when we are relying so much on what happened last season. And I think what I was going to say is that I think this just shows for us that, it's hard going from season to season to know who's going to pop off. We don't have many guys in our league that are consistently going to be top guys in the league, right? Like, you even look at the top 5 from this year, it's completely different than the top 5 from last year, right? Lance Williams was, I think, number 2 for back row last season, number 6 this year. Vian Conradi was, I think, he was ranked total in the 70s. And I mean, he didn't play the full season last year, but he wasn't one of the top back rows last year. And we saw kind of, that's why he kind of was left out of our top 5 in our predictions. So definitely maybe some hindsight on our part, but it just shows how difficult it is from year to year to really narrow down. It's not like other fantasy sports.
Well,
you don't have that consistency.
That's the thing, right? I think there's a combination of factors. Is that one, we're going off of a track record that's not very long. Obviously, this is just our first season that we expanded the stats. We did extrapolate it last season, so we're really going off of 1 year's numbers heading into this year, and then obviously heading into 2024. Even that's not going to be that much. With only 2 seasons of track record essentially to go off of. And again, to your point, Matt, there's just a whole lot of movement in Major League Rugby, new faces, different positions, people slotting into different opportunities, starting in different roles. It does move a lot, but I do think there is optimism here that as we continue to progress through this fantasy journey, that this will get closer and closer. And I mean, again, like I said, Lance Williams, not essentially that far off. I think being like 5 or 4 spots off here in our case is not necessarily the end all be all. But what is the end all be all is the next guy we got here. You at number 2 have Devin Short. I at number 3 had Devin Short. He finishes off as the back row 73. Again, I'm not going to say that to give us excuses, but again, this is another availability issue. Guy was injured. Didn't play much this season. It was a tough one.
Devin Short played 3 games this year. He had a stellar last year, and the way that he looked for Nola Gold last year it was hard to leave him out of our top 5s. It'll be interesting to see what he does for Seattle this upcoming season. Interesting to see whether he comes back to that form. Will definitely be somebody that you want to keep an eye on for the draft in terms of next year. I don't think he'll end up in a top 5 of ours for sure, but yeah, it was hard to not choose him. I think he just ran into injury. It's tough to predict that.
Yeah, and then moving on to the next position, Matt, you had number 3 at Reichert Hadding. Again, I think we talked about Hadding enough here. Number 4, you had Brendan O'Connor. I had Henko Gramicius. For me, another availability thing, Gramicius getting injured. I mean, first 2 matches, he looked pretty solid. 14.5 points, 16.1. Kind of tailed off a little bit. Got injured in round 4, made it a sub appearance in round 16. I had high hopes for the Houston SaberCats. Obviously, they were in that position for fighting in that playoff spot, that race with the Utah Warriors. But I think Henko Gramicius would have been a big part of that. Just again, not available, injury, tough.
Yeah, and you can say the same thing about Brendan O'Connor. I mean, after 4 games, he got hurt and didn't come back until round 16, and he came back and just wanted to get yellow card after yellow card after yellow card, right? So, it's tough when he had a good 2022. You saw him the way that Brendan O'Connor was kind of a staple of that of that New York Ironworkers back row, or New York Rugby, whatever they were in 2022. He was a staple of their back row, and he was a hard guy not to select, and just another case, kind of like Devin Short, of look, he got hurt 4 games into the year. He's not going to crack any top 5, even if you're Riker Hatting, when you only play 6 games.
Yeah, and again, back row 53 for Hanko Gramicious, back row 64 for Brent O'Connor. And then at the number 5 spot, again, 2 different names that we had here. I had Ronan Foley, another situation of injury, but hey, he came back. And I mean, he was on pace for a pretty solid there if he had kept it going. Back row 34, and then you had Mitch Jacobson, who, again, not too shabby, ended up as the back row 21. For me, for Ronan Foley, I mean, finishes off the season with 74.6 points. Obviously got injured in that first week, and then makes the return though in round 10, and then starts to pick up the pace. I mean, around 14, 15, and 16, 20.2, 15.3, 10.2, and that 10.2 match, he had 28 tackles. Ronan Foley obviously had the ability to get up there, and I think that just puts an emphasis on how crazy that back row line is for the Seattle Seawolves. I mean, they've got Ronan Foley, and then 2 guys that cracked the top 5 with Charles Elton and Reichert Hatting. Pretty impressive stuff there for the Seattle Seahawks. And then for you, Mitch Jacobson, I mean, it's a tough one, but again, not too far outside. 100.4 fantasy points. Mitch Jacobson.
Yeah,
he was there.
You know what? I had one of the top 5. I made it a effort to make sure that I was picking one new guy that was coming into the league, at least in each top 5, and Mitch Jacobson was the guy that I chose. I don't regret it. I think it was a solid pick. He didn't have the season that maybe we wanted in terms of being just a star-studded season, being one of the Jacobson brothers. But the way that he impacted the New England Free Jacks, he ended up being captain, I think, for a few weeks as well. And I think it just, he played 12 games, didn't start them all, didn't play full 80 for all of them either. And it was just because the New England Free Jacks had that deep of a lineup and that deep of a forward pack that they could kind of afford to take a guy like Mitch Jacobson off. And they had a guy like Vian Conradi sitting there, and it's tough. It's tough to have 2 guys being able to make the offensive impact all the time. So yeah, I mean, still a good season from Mitch Jacobson. Didn't crack the top 5, and I don't know. I suck at predictions, clearly.
And I love the pick at the time. I mean, obviously with the Waikato roots and me being a Waikato Chiefs fan, it's always a good to see a guy getting there on top. I just wasn't able to get up to that point. But I mean, I think Mitch Jacobson is a nice player to kind of round it off with, because I think this is what you're going to expect from an average back row player. Around this, 100, 110 point mark, hovers around that double digit point total, has the ability to go off with a bunch of tackles, will score a try here and there. This is what you're going to get from a back row position, or this is the standard, at least, that you're aiming for. And the advantages that having guys like Tom Florence, Wyatt Vian Conradi, Christian Poitevin, Reichert Hatting, the guys that just have that X factor to go off, score you tries, get meters gained, on top of what a back rower typically does, it kind of just emphasizes that even further. But again, back row position is fun to talk about from a fantasy perspective, just because there's so many points being involved. We're talking about this guy being an average guy at 100 points. This is basically what the top front rower was getting you, or what the, near the top of what the second row was giving you as well. So obviously there's a whole lot of points to be had from this back row position. Yeah,
100%. And I don't know. It's tough looking at these top 5s, Ryan. It's tough. All
right. Let's get it off the screen.
I'm hoping
that get it off the screen.
Yeah, I'm hoping that next week, right? Next week we get into the good stuff.
Yep.
We get into our bread and butter. We get into the 9s. We get into the 10s the week after. We get into the centers after that. We get into the back 3. As you get farther to the back 3, you get to the fast guys, and that's far away from my bread and butter. But next week, I'm excited for next week. But unfortunately, Ryan, we're staying tied this week.
Yeah, we are staying tied. We are now 0.
What a boring matchup.
And 3. You could argue that it's neck and neck, Matt. It's coming right down to the wire.
If we finish this whole thing and we're just tied the whole time, it's just gonna be dumb. Why do we keep
that would be dumb. That would be dumb. But I do feel like we might have a little bit of a change coming up in next week's ranking when we do break down the halfbacks, the scrum halves, the guys that we are the specialty at, Matt and myself being former nines in our playing days ourselves. And I guess either you could say that it's exciting and there should be a little bit more breakdown value there, but you could also say it's also nerve-wracking for us because we should be getting these predictions right.
And we won't.
And yeah, it'll be interesting to see whether the tide will turn here and how crazy these have been. But it's gonna be fun. These breaking down these. I think the biggest thing as we wrap up the show here is that I think breaking down not only these predictions, but actually breaking down the top fives at each of the positions so far doing front row, second row, now back row. We're getting an understanding of what each of these positions provides from a fantasy perspective and just that much more knowledge of how to approach each position heading into 2024. And that's what this fantasy MLR journey is all about. Not only trying to give it to the masses, but also trying to figure out this thing ourselves and trying to get the best strategy so you can become a Fantasy Ruckers League champ like Matt here. But yeah, Scrum Halves next week, Matt. Counting down the days for it to come. Should be good.
Yeah, I'm excited. Excited to see how wrong I am again. But I'll be wrong worse or better. I'll be better. I'll be worse at being wrong that next week.
All right. For Matt Yee, for myself, for Devin Vandy Vanderpool, who should be back next week. We will see you next week on another episode of the Fantasy Ruckers Show.
Miss you, Vandy.
You've been listening to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, covering everything rugby from the MLR and beyond. We hope you enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review, and be sure to tell all your friends. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, connect with us on social media at the Fantasy Ruckers. Till next time, this is the Fantasy Ruckers Show, signing off.